The Republic of Paraguay is a country whose borders have been forged after heroic actions of thousands of patriots. Actions that have marked a history full of sad episodes that are proudly remembered by the Paraguayan people. Are you interested in learning about the amazing history of this country? Alright, then stay until the end of the video. What is the territory of present-day Paraguay? It is estimated that the territory of present-day Paraguay was populated around 6,000 years before Christ, with the Kangan being the oldest ancestors, although they would eventually look north, currently existing in Brazilian territory. But the three most prominent prehistoric ethnic groups in Paraguay are the Pampids, in the region of Paraguay, the Chaco region, the Lagids, in the eastern region, and the Amazonids, on the banks of the Paraguay River. Currently, the population has been concentrating in the area located between the Paraná and Paraguay rivers, logically richer in resources. By the 15th century, the supremacy in the region would be obtained by the well-known Guarani ethnic group, who would expand from the north thanks to their numerical superiority and modern techniques. Educational. It is estimated that the Guarani would have grouped into partially organized states under the command of a Turicha. Likewise, they were characterized by their warlike skill, their mastery of agriculture and the geography of the region, and for being skilled canoe navigators. Being quite belligerent peoples, the Guarani would enter into constant conflicts both with other ethnic groups and among peoples of the same language. These would be present at the arrival of the Europeans. And speaking of Europeans, one of the first to arrive would be Alejo Garcia, who came to live with a group of Guarani and invade Inca territory to take some resources, which did not sit very well with him. A decade later, after a failed attempt to settle in present-day Buenos Aires, the settlers led by Pedro de Mendoza would move to the banks of the Paraguay River after being attacked by the indigenous people, founding the fort of Asuncion in 1537. Over time, this fort, founded by Juan de Salazar y Espinosa, would become an important city. Administratively, Asuncion would be included within the territory of the Governorate of New Andalusia, also known as the Governorate of the Rio de la Plata in Paraguay, and which would initially be part of the Viceroyalty. Asuncion was known as the Mother of Cities, as from its settlers departed to various cities of the southern cone. In the face of the settlement of the cities founded by the Spaniards, they eventually came to have power over the indigenous people. Paraguay would not be alien to the system of entrepreneurship, although with the arrival of Governor Hernando Arias de Saavedra, an attempt was made to claim their rights. Under his rule, Paraguay became the first indigenous nation ever. In the 19th century, the Jesuits arrived, who would begin the Christianization of the Guarani, thus giving rise to the Jesuit reductions. About 30 autonomous missionary towns, of which 8 were in Paraguayan territory. Worth noting, the indigenous people were allowed to keep their language and customs. Hernando Arias also recommended to the king the decentralization of power from New Andalusia, so that the founded cities do not fall into oblivion, which is why in 1617 it would be divided into the governorates of the Rio de la Plata, with its capital in Buenos Aires, and the Governorate of Paraguay, with its capital in Asuncion, plus the cities of Villarrica, Santiago de Gueres, and Ciudad Real. Yes, the foundations of the future Argentina and Paraguay are being laid from this moment. During this period, the Battle of Borore stands out. The Battle of Borore, where Guarani from the Jesuit reductions expelled the Bandeirantes, land pirates from Portuguese territories, is a notable event from this period. Yes, Paraguay might not have existed and could have been a part of present-day Brazil if not for this. Another notable event was the Paraguayan Comunera Revolution, in which a group of Paraguayan civilians rebelled against the governor. Although this rebellion was crushed, it could be considered as the first uprising against authority in Hispanic America. Do you remember I mentioned about the reductions? Well, it turns out that the Spaniards would decide to distribute these territories with the Portuguese, so the Jesuit resistance would lead to the Guarani Wars, which would represent the beginning of the abandonment of the missions by the Guarani. The Jesuits, for their part, would end up being expelled in 1767. To avoid further rebellions and facilitate the governance of the empire, in 1776, the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata was created with its capital in Buenos Aires, separating from the Viceroyalty of Peru, of which Paraguay would be a part. In 1782, on the territory of the governorship of Paraguay, the Intendancy of Paraguay was created, where 4 town councils operated. With the weakening of the Spaniards during the Napoleonic Wars, the May Revolution would take place from Buenos Aires, in which a government board was formed, deposing the viceroy from power, a board that the Intendancy of Paraguay would refuse to form. Faced with the refusal, the River Plate Army under the command of Manuel del Grano would initiate a military expedition to Paraguay to demand its subordination. This campaign resulted in a failure, and it would be the precursor to the May Revolution of 1811, in which, to ensure sovereignty, 2 partners would be added to power, in addition to the governor. One of them, the ideologue of Paraguay's independence, José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia. As for the Spaniards, well, as the only way to reach Paraguay was via the Rio de la Plata, they did not intervene, this being one of the independence processes. In a tranquil America, after this formation, there were 4 congresses to decide the future of the nation, after which it would be named the Republic. Fulgencio Yegros would be elected as consul, and finally, Dr. Francia would be appointed as perpetual dictator. Yes, not at all inspired by ancient Rome. Said and done, Rodriguez de Francia would rule until his death. Although unlike most other newly independent countries, Paraguay remained stable and almost without civil conflicts during its first decades. The truth is that Dr. Francia would isolate the country, banning river traffic to Argentina and restricting entry and exit from the territory. This period of self-sufficiency and delay would end after his death in 1840, in which, after a brief period of anarchy, Carlos Antonio López would assume power. After the drafting of the new presidential constitution and the Act of Independence of Paraguay, where its independence was recognized mainly by the Argentine Confederation, López strengthened the army, opened up to international trade, modernized the country's infrastructure and education, all this in 3 presidential terms until his death in 1862, after which he would be succeeded by his son, the well-known Francisco Solano López. Solano López would achieve good diplomatic relations with European countries such as the United Kingdom, from whom he obtained international recognition and the necessary investments for the economic and industrial takeoff of the country. However, diplomatic relations with neighbors, with whom territorial disputes were still present, were another story. During the civil war in Uruguay between the Blanco and Colorado parties, Brazil would initiate an invasion in favor of the latter. López, who supported the Blanco party, would capture 2 Brazilian merchant ships in protest, thus breaking relations between both countries. The drums of a bloody war were beginning to sound. Yes, this would trigger the Triple Alliance between Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, although the second would join the war after the Paraguayan invasion of Corrientes, and the third after Venancio Flores of the Colorado Party came to power, sponsored by Brazil. Despite having sacrificed the lives of nearly 90% of adult men in combat, Paraguay could not withstand this triple alliance during the deadliest war in Latin American history, which included disturbing episodes such as the Battle of Acostañu, where due to the lack of adult men, Paraguayan children would go out to fight. In this memorable battle, San Minario Conde de O, in command of the Allied troops, would wipe out the lives of 3,500 children in addition to burning a hospital with war wounded in the vicinity. Why am I telling you this? So you know what was the greatest war crime in American history. Another important fact, the death of Marshal Solano Locke. One of the most representative deaths of a ruler in action in history. This would seal the end of the war, which meant for Paraguay, in addition to a demographic catastrophe, the loss of disputed territories to Argentina and Brazil, as well as a 6-year military occupation by the latter. In the face of the disaster after the war, Paraguay would stagnate economically for the following decades. To this is added that with the emergence of new political parties such as the Liberal and the Colorado, a period of political instability would reign in the country. A revolution in 1891 and 3 civil wars. The Colorado Party would manage to govern between 1886 and 1904, when President Juan Antonio Escura is overthrown by a coup d'etat. This is followed by various liberal governments almost uninterruptedly until 1936. And when I told you instability, well, I meant it seriously. Well, during this entire period, very few presidents managed to complete the constitutional term of 4 years. One of them was Eduardo Scherer, who achieved economic growth thanks to World War I. And in the face of new territorial disputes, Paraguay would once again enter a major conflict. This time, the deadliest in America during the 20th century, the Chaco War against Bolivia for control of the Chaco Boreal, an almost uninhabited area whose allocation by the Spaniards would have been ambiguous, given that it was not fully colonized. After 3 years of war in a hostile theater of operations, Paraguay would reaffirm its sovereignty over 3/4 of the disputed territory, after agreeing with Bolivia to cede an area on the Paraguay River, which serves it to have an outlet to the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, the violence would not yet end in Paraguay, as with the emergence of new political groups, such as the Severista Revolutionary Concentration and the Paraguayan Communist Party, a new civil war would occur. In this, these two groups, allied with the liberals, confront the government supported by the Colorados. Victory of this last side, which consolidates the hegemony of this party in power, after a toll of about 30,000 dead. This would be the prelude to the rise to power of the longest dictatorship in the history of Paraguay. Led by a Colorado leader during the War of 47, Alfredo Stroessner, whose regime was characterized by harsh repression of his political opposition, a rapprochement with the armed forces, and the emergence of monopolistic public service companies. While an acceleration of the economy was achieved, the fact is that rural poverty continued to increase. The dictatorship would end with a coup d'etat in 1989, led by Andrés Rodríguez, with the support of the United States. Stroessner would be overthrown, and Rodríguez assumes the presidency, initiating the democratic transition. After a decade of stability, this was effected during the Paraguayan March, in which, after the vice president's maneuver, the opposition blames General Lino Oviedo and President Cubas. The latter was forced to resign. But the Colorado Party's hegemony would not end until the rise of Fernando Lugo from a new political party as president, although he would not finish his term due to accusations of poor performance in his duties. This political crisis would result in suspensions from Mercosur and UNASUR. It is worth noting that since shortly before his term, the last governments have had to face the insurgency in the northeast of the country, led by the Paraguayan People's Army, a Marxist guerrilla organization that continues to operate to this day. In the end, the Colorado Party would be elected again after the governments of Horacio Cartes and Mario Abdo Benitez, the current president of Paraguay. With the return of democracy, the sanctions imposed on Paraguay would be lifted. And with this, we have reached the present day. What do you think? Has all the bloodshed in the name of the dignity of the Paraguayan people been worth it? Was Marshal Lopez a national hero, or a ruler who led the country to catastrophe? Don't forget to leave your comment. And if you like this video, support me with a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you would like to support this project, any donation on Patreon would be welcome. See you next time.